I must admit that when I was initially informed about the Ada Louise Huxtable Prize in Architecture, I thought this must be for another Angela Davis. My name is rather common, so I thought that just as there is a legal scholar whose name is Angela Davis, with whom I'm often mistaken, there must be an architect named Angela Davis, whom I have not yet met. But when I read the announcement and realized that the prize was indeed being offered to me, my immediate response was that even as I consider this a profound honor, it is indeed a deep honor to have been chosen to receive this award. There's also a mistake here, but one of a different order. And I cannot, in good conscience, accept this award without pointing out the collective character of abolitionist activism, scholarship, and writing that you are recognizing. And I say this because I don't want my name to overshadow those who are most responsible for the historical emergence of anti-prison abolitionism and for the elaboration of anti-carceral strategies today as essential to the reimagining of our futures. And I especially want us to recognize that many of the ideas that constitute the foundational questions of prison and indeed also police abolition emanate from people who have themselves been incarcerated. Every time I've learned that a major organization in the field of architecture that has spoken out against or banned the designing of execution facilities, cells for solitary confinement, jails, prisons, police stations, I applaud those within the field who have resisted the supposition that because architects generate our built environment, and because carceral structures are fundamental elements of that built environment, they must continue to design these spaces. Ironically, the centuries-long quest for better, more humane jails and prisons, a process within which architects have been necessarily central, has been largely responsible for the permanence of this institution, and thus also for its increasingly racist and repressive character. The call for prison reform has unfortunately served to stunt the professional and popular imagination with respect to the generation of safe and secure communities. It has not prevented the increasing reliance on carceral institutions, immigrant detention facilities, for example, youth jails, the family policing system. So by examining what Foucault called the carceral archipelago that sustains the Israeli occupation of Palestine, we learn that we could not focus so narrowly on the actual institution of the prison, because that would mean that we failed to recognize how carcerality infects the entire society. A myopic focus on the problematic institutions of our society that fail to generate safety and security will never achieve that of which they are inherently incapable. By shifting from the centuries-old efforts to make these institutions work more effectively to larger questions regarding the kind of society we might need in order not to be compelled to rely on violence and repression as the principal source of safety and security, we encounter then the imperative to build a revolutionary new world. And it's actually quite simple. We need more and better and non-commoditized educational institutions. In other words, free public education from kindergarten to the postgraduate level. We need affordable and beautiful housing that helps bring communities together. We need more cultural spaces, such as more non-elitist museums and concert halls and parks and other green spaces, such as the one that Cop City in Atlanta is supplanting. We need revolutionary conceptions of what our built environment might be. I thank you deeply for awarding me the Ada Louise Huxtable Prize in Architecture. Thank you.
Congratulations. Very
Thank you
exciting
so
for you
much.
to have this award and to acknowledge your contribution to architecture. And I wanted to ask you first of all, what can spatial practitioners learn from the abolitionist imagination? What are the values and ideas from the Black feminist imaginary that you would encourage or view as most urgent to put into practice in order to reimagine the built environment and our societies without prisons?
Well, as I was trying to point out earlier, the abolitionist imagination attempts to pull back and to kind of use an analogy from photography or filmmaking. And it attempts to pull back and take account not only of the problematic institution, in this particular case, the prison, but also of its conditions of possibility, also of its surroundings, also of its relationality with its social environment. We've learned from the failed effort to abolish slavery. As W.E.B. Du Bois pointed out, slavery was declared unconstitutional. It was declared abolished, but we learned that we cannot simply focus on the institution itself. We have to identify the extent to which it has polluted the entire society and attempt to develop new foundations, economic, social, cultural, for a future society. I would say thus, inclusiveness, deep relationality, a sense that, and now I'm speaking more specifically to your question about Black feminism and what Black feminism has offered. For example, we know that it is impossible to rid our world of racism if we don't also focus on capitalism, gender discrimination, homophobia, and other related modes of oppression. That is what we refer to as intersectionality, which so often is focused on identity. But I think that it is also very important to consider the intersectionality of struggles. And just briefly, what can be said about Black women all over the world? And I think this is perhaps a core value, that Black women never struggle for themselves alone. It is always about the larger community. As a matter of fact, I remember a slogan from the Black women's movement in Brazil. When Black women stand up, the world stands with them. And so I think that this anti-individualistic mode of struggle is an important value for everyone. So in brief, I would say the imperative against individualism and also the relationality and the inclusiveness. So these are all values all of us need in order to imagine a better world where we can, all be considered uh, recipients of justice and equality.
I also would like to ask you to, and maybe perhaps more invite you to conjure an abolitionist spatial future. What would an abolitionist built environment look like? What would it contain? What would it not contain? And perhaps more importantly, what would it feel like?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to engage in this form of imagining. And I think I would first say that I know that there are debates in the field of architecture about permanence and impermanence. Is architecture inherently permanent? What role does impermanence play? And I wanted to mention that the Mellon Foundation has a very interesting monuments project. It's not so much about architecture, but it is about the built environment and the role of monuments, of which monuments should be removed and which ones should be retained and under what conditions. I urge you to look at the description of the project on the website of the Mellon Foundation. It's very interesting. They're having to rethink the entire history of the country and the relevance of that history to the present. Now, well, how would I imagine a spatial future? I've always been very much interested in time and temporality, yeah. And the ways in which we often think so simplistically about the unfolding of time. I would imagine a spatial future that does not attempt to arrest time, one in which temporality itself is invited to be a part of the arrangement, one that would take account of what we do not yet know, what is yet to be discovered. As humans, we have the tendency to assume that what we know now and what exists now will forever be. And at the same time, we know that everything changes. So how would that environment, that spatial future communicate change and changeability? I think I would want green space. Green space that encourages us to interrogate our relationship to other forms of life, to not to assume that human life is at the very top of the pyramid, but to imagine a relationality among animals who are human and animals who are not human. I would want a spatial future that encourages us to interrogate our relationship to the world, a relationship that is expansive, but also one that reminds us of our limitations and our fallibility. I can't tell you what that would look like, but this is how I would wish to be moved by a built environment in the future.
So, lastly, I would like to ask you, in Europe today, and I'm thinking particular about Sweden, where I'm from, we're currently facing increased investment in law enforcement and militarization, which has resulted in significant decrease in investment in education, culture, and healthcare, only to name a few. In the face of the rise of extreme far-right politics in Scandinavia, Europe, and elsewhere, the abolitionist imagination and the radical envisioning of other possible futures is as important as it ever has been. How can it be defended?
I don't know whether there's a clear-cut answer, except perhaps to emphasize that the social transformation that we want now may never be entirely achievable. But at the same time, in the course of seeking to effect these changes, we recognize that so much more is necessary. And I'm thinking, excuse me, about the way in which new conceptions and new movements began to arise in the course of aspiring to achieve goals that later on we recognize really fell short of what we actually needed. And I often use the example of the Black movement in the US, which began as a putatively ungendered notion of Black liberation, but it was really only about men. It was very much gendered. As a matter of fact, the subject of that liberatory effort was always the Black man. And I often make the point that the majority of the people who were actually involved in the struggle for freedom of the Black man were Black women who did not, including myself, recognize that we weren't even including ourselves. And so I use this as an example of how had we not engaged in that very flawed movement for Black freedom, we never would have become aware of the importance of gender and sexuality. And if one looks at, all of the ways in which our notion of freedom has expanded over the last decades, we have to imagine that this is going to occur in the future. So this is what I mean by recognizing that what we do not yet know is as important as what we do know. And this means that whatever we might believe about radical future possibilities, it is only through praxis and what you might call the epistemology of praxis, what we learn, the knowledge that we acquire in the course of engaging in that praxis, that it's only through that dynamic that we will make any changes at all. And it is only through sustained praxis that we learn more about what we actually need. Now, the second part of your question about the Scandinavian countries, it is very interesting, isn't it? That a few decades ago, Scandinavia was pointed to as the spot on the globe that had the most progressive criminal justice system, one to be emulated by countries everywhere. As a matter of fact, I went to Sweden in the 1990s, I think it was the mid-1990s, to interview women in prison there in comparison to interviews that we had done. I had a collaborator with women in prison in the US. And of course, I should also point out that the very idea of prison abolition is deeply rooted in Scandinavian history. The Norwegian criminologist Thomas Mathisen, who wrote a book called Politics of Abolition. This was one of the first texts that not only seriously argued for abolition, but demonstrated the role that organized groups of people in prison played in urging us to take abolition seriously. But nothing is ever permanent. Not even the architectural structures that convey, that kind of permanence by their very constitution. And I think this means that in Scandinavia, that is still touted as a progressive part of the world with respect to prisons, cannot live on its past accomplishments. And I think the only response would be to encourage the development of mass movements. As a matter of fact, during this period, which is an electoral period in the U.S., and I'm sure that you in Canada are following our very difficult news about who may be running, and but I won't get into that. I will point out that it is very rare that elected officials change history. And I would say perhaps single individuals never fundamentally affect the course of history. It is always the collective imagination of masses of people who express themselves through demonstrations, protests, and I want to conclude by reminding us, which I think we need to remind ourselves, that just a few years ago, in the summer of 2020, there were uprisings all over North America, all over the world. As a matter of fact, it represented a moment, a kind of collective prise de conscience, where there was this recognition that something had to be done about the structural racism that defines our society here in the US, your society in Canada, and it was as if people were prepared to sacrifice their own lives in order to move forward in the struggle. I say this because the millions of people who came out into the streets all over the world join their sisters, brothers, comrades at a time when we had not yet figured out how the coronavirus was communicated, so that this was quite possibly at the expense of their own lives that they stood up in this way. And I don't think whatever we do, however we're planning to participate in movements in the future, or whether we're not at all planning to participate in those movements, we should recognize what a phenomenal conjuncture the summer of 2020 marked. And as a matter of fact, it's my opinion that we're still living that conjuncture, that even though we don't have the vast demonstrations, people are not out in the streets, but this is a time when we should be following up on the mass insights that were represented by that period. And so I am so happy that in the field of architecture, there are many people who are recognizing the part that architecture has played historically in creating these institutions that communicate racism and repression to the world. Thank you very much. Again, I am so deeply thankful to you for awarding me this phenomenal